Okay, we're getting towards the middle of November already. Okay, so last lecture, let's make sure let's do a quick roll call really quick. Make sure we have all pods here. Do we have pod 1? Perfect. Pod 2? Pod 3? Pod 4? Pod 5? Pod 6? Pod 7? Pod 8? Pod 9? Pod A? Pod B? And pod C.
Sorry, I just pod 9.
Perfect. Okay. So let's start with the first order of business. I was asked, and I'll bring it to the floor. We can discuss this about having the deliverables for the workshop be counted as bonus as opposed towards the main set of points. Would that be all right with everybody? Would you prefer for that to be bonus material, given the workload of what still has to happen over the course of this semester?
Well, let me ask this, what is the main material? Like, what are we actually being graded on?
Okay, so if we reduce the deliverable,
Right.
then the main materials would be as such. It would be the IT workshop. It would be the reviews on the IT workshop, because it's still important that everyone gives feedback.
Okay.
The deliverable for the workshop would then be considered bonus submissions, and it would be your pod's contribution towards the final project would be obviously the main contributing factor. Very good question, though, to ask what actually would count if we start pushing things into the bonus category.
I think that's a very good.
I don't have, right? So that means that grades would then be based off of IT workshop.
Yeah.
I mean, how much bonus is it? Because that was a lot of deliverables.
Well, it would be it wouldn't be an all or nothing thing, right? I'd probably stage it as each deliverable would be worth X amount of bonus points. These would be the reviews or feedback. And then 3 would be the capstone. So then if we do that, we could recode, we can encode this as being the main sets of points for the course, and then bonus can then be those workshop deliverables, which I still would recommend everyone doing, so they have an option to touch those technologies. But if push comes to shove, it's much more important that you focus your time on this and much less on this. So if I want to push you towards something, this is the more important set of tasks. Or we can keep the syllabus as it were. In favor of adjusting it? In favor of keeping it the same?
Wait, I'll think about it.
You want to try that like that?
We can do this. Do we prefer anonymous voting?
I close your eyes.
Oh, I like that. Closing your eyes. That is anonymous. Okay. If you prefer to keep the syllabus as it were, in terms of the rubric, raise your hand as it is first defined in the class. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, if you would prefer for it to be refactored, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, well.
There's people missing too.
What's that?
There's people missing.
Well, whatever.
There's like a full on this place.
I think we have.
Well, you know what? The disadvantage with not being in class is your vote doesn't get heard.
Fair enough.
If you can't be here for class, you shouldn't have a voice to vote. Okay, well, based off of plurality, we'll go with the refactored version. Okay, more importantly though,
So are there bonus points for doing them on time, submitting them last Friday?
Yes,
Or there's actually a bonus point for doing them?
Yes.
on time?
yes. The more important thing is going to be the Capstone project. Let's talk about where we're at with that. Okay, so last lecture, we talked about the kickoff for MVP, remember? And so we mentioned a couple of things about what would have to be had in the MVP, and then the next thing that we needed to happen was that each pod was going to then be defined, or would not defined, but take on a to-do task so that we can start making progress towards getting something complete. So in today's class, I want to go through each pod's assignment and just kind of make sure what they intend to do and when the expected deliverable date is going to be on that. Does that seem reasonable? Okay, so before we go through the set of task list here, I want to be very clear on what is going to be encoded inside of our MVP. What is going to be a part of it. So let's open. One thing I definitely like about being in person now is that I can actually see all you and we can talk much easier without the friction of onlineness. Like it was very difficult to kind of get a sense of, just through chat. Okay, so with that said, who wants to kind of sum up some of the components, some of the subsystems we're going to necessarily have to have for what we consider a minimum viable product? In fact, before we even start doing that, what is a minimum viable product?
The bare bones, you get something working.
Yeah, it's our baseline bare bones system that can serve as our proof of concept so that we can immediately show something to our other stakeholders, our non-technical stakeholders, and get some insight on them if even the foundation, if the bones of our application is even going to operate and work the way we anticipate. So we had a good long discussion, right? We kind of clued in. Who wants to kind of talk about some of the subsystems that we identified as being part of the MVP build that mandatorily necessarily has to be there?
We want to have a database set up.
We need a database, so we need data persistence, right? We need a place that is a single source of truth where all of our data is managed at, right? We've talked about two different options last lecture. We can just deploy everything onto each Raspberry Pi, and then that would be awful, right? That seemed like a not a way to go. Like even just saying that probably feels dirty, right? So clearly we need to have a database. So that's going to be part of our MVP build. Let me erase this. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, and then we'll take a look at our task list. So here we have some kind of database. Okay. And this is obviously going to be for, well, our data persistence. Okay, what else did we say we needed for our MVP build? We need leap motion integration. And the leap motion integration only at the client level, right? Okay. What's another component that we need inside? What's that?
What do you mean only at?
That's a very good question. So let's kind of like break that down just to make sure that what I'm thinking in my mind is exactly the same thing everyone else is thinking in their mind. So we're talking about an application that's necessarily going to be networked. And so our networked application is going to have different roles or responsibilities. And so each of these responsibilities can actually be on a different Raspberry Pi, we can think of, on a different environment. And so we'll have one Raspberry Pi that physically connects to a TV. And so the reason why we need to have a Raspberry Pi that physically connects to the TV is that we need to run the drivers for Leap Motion, for the Leap Motion to provide commands to that television. And so our management point, our computing station that's going to run all the software, that's going to grab the input from the Leap Motion and then display it onto our kiosk, onto our television, is going to be it's going to effectively be what we're going to consider the client. And it's a client because really its one role and responsibility is to interface with the end user, using the Leap Motion as the input metaphor. So presumably you'd have like a prospective student, you'd have a faculty member, you'd have a tutor, you'd have maybe someone seeking a tutor, you'd have a current student who can then do some kind of gestural input on the Leap Motion, and then that's going to drive whatever the set of options are inside of our television. So all those sets of options are going to be exposed to the end user as part of the client side of our application. And the reason why I say it's a client side of the application is a lot of the data management, a lot of like the administrative controls, a lot of the way that all of the information is fed towards our kiosk is probably going to be driven by some backend server. So you could think of each of the Raspberry Pis where their role is to be able to go ahead and display some sets of, let's say in our MVP build, the primary duty of our kiosk is simply just to show images with relevant information. And you might be able to select from a grouping of different types of images. So maybe a set of images could be research posters. Maybe a set of images could be student leadership adverts for things like workshops or meetings or parties or things like that. Maybe a subset of those images could be for tutoring schedules or tutoring information, contact information, things like that. So we could start to say, oh yeah, we have different groups of information. We might give the end user the ability to select from group A versus group B versus group C based off of what they're wanting to learn about. Very simple task, right? And so if we want to start breaking down, how is that going to be managed? Well, you'd have your server where the administrators might be able to define how each information type is clustered to say, oh, this is tutoring related stuff. This is student organization related stuff. This is research related stuff. And then they can actually add or delete images that go into those individual subcategories. And then the server then could push that data to the client, or more accurately, the client can request that data from the server, which would then provide it back towards the client. And so the clients are responsible for interfacing with the end user using the Leap Motion, making requests to the server, getting the data from the server, and then redisplaying it back onto the television. So that would be like the role of the client. And the role of the server would be to wait for requests from the client and then provide whatever information that they need. And these clients then, the different types of requests the server should be able to accept are going to be either requests that comes from a kiosk or a request that comes from like an administrator role, right? So it's either trying to access information inside of the repository of types of information that the server can provide, or an administrator can actually add or delete information or define new categories inside of the server. Did that kind of sum up pretty well on terms of how we can envision at least a baseline implementation of our application? So
I want to say, right, use one of those, Raspberry Pis as the server.
yeah, so we have full control over all the hardware. We have multiple Raspberry Pis enough where they can be dedicated clients and servers. And then we can even have a pod who's tasked with the role of getting them to intercommunicate, right? These are the types of jobs, these are types of tasks we're going to have to start defining, right? Very small bite-sized tasks that we can get feedback on very rapidly within days to a week. If we want to have at least an MVP build built by, let's say, the end of the semester, at least. Okay, so with that said, Is that pretty consistent with what we kind of set up and defined last class? So we said we needed to have, so what's that? So we needed a database, right? We needed the Leap Motion integration, which is gonna be at the client level. We needed to be able to set up some kind of REST API such that our clients and servers can cross communicate. We talked about an authentication system for the administrator roles, right? Admins would require some kind of authentication. So database, Leap Motion, REST API, which allows the server and client to communicate. Okay. And then there was some kind of mechanism, you needed your user interface. So we talked about Leap Motion, but should we desperatize between Leap Motion and user interface? I don't know. Possibly one team could be responsible for producing the UI and the other one can help coordinate that to pivot from a mouse-based UI to a Leap Motion UI. That way you're not burdening one pod with too many responsibilities. So maybe UI development is going to be different than our Leap Motion integration. And let's see here. I want to say that there was one other thing we had discussed last lecture that really defined our MVP build, right? We needed data persistence. Oh, it was managing images.
Like a job board.
Or just how would we go ahead and encode that? What is the software-driven solution for being able to upload and display images inside of our software system?
Like describe it as our like public system where we host, where students, the department, and the university could host events and workshops for jobs.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about in the MVP build?
Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And so so this brings up a good point. Like, who would be the responsible agents or users that we've been defining them as admins, right? Who are going to be the admins to the system that allows for data to be added? Should that be opened up publicly, or will they be special users who have the ability to upload images? Clearly, it can't just be anybody because there might be an abuse of that. Someone could potentially upload images that are. Yeah.
How would it say people with permission?
Yeah. So
Like they have to be granted that.
What about a request system?
a request system. So that's, I like that. So our MVP should have some kind of request, like a request form or something that you can actually submit kind of in a staging area, all the images you want, and then some administrator can go behind and hit the OK button. I like that. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, our pod was actually talking about this, having some kind of like authentication portal that's similar to that, where some admin could log on to view requests. Like the portal itself might be open for anybody to submit something to, and then someone with permissions can go in there and view each entry and submit them, and then potentially send them off to maybe specific, like.
Yeah, and make sure they're labeled and categorized correctly. And I like just.
We can enforce specific, what's the word? We can enforce like specific formats that they have to be in, for example, or things that they come with in order to be like multiple quote, so that it's easier for whoever they admin to like go through them. Stuff like that. We can implement something like that. That's what we were thinking about.
This was a good suggestion. I'm glad you brought that up, and that's also a good suggestion too. And I think that both those should be part of the MVP build.
I was thinking like the branching off of like admin and authentication, we have like a role management system where specific, like bottlenecking like one group or one administrator to like a request will slow down like that process. So we can have multiple groups that can approve requests.
You bring up a great point. So yeah, we're starting to see how these, like, some of these systems like authentication might have better granularity that can be assigned to a different team that can then start defining like maybe roles and what does a role data type look like and what are the responsibilities and what are the various different roles. That's perfect. So the point that I want to get to by the end of today is I want to make sure we've identified all the subsystems and start going into the gradients of the subsystems. And then I want to go ahead and refactor, if we need to, our to-do list, the items that are inside of our project board to be consistent with tasks that we can do right away, right now, that leads us towards the creation of the MVP.
Another feature or another system I was thinking of would be room management. So if we want to like book rooms or track the classes that are going on, what rooms are available. And then also like visualizing that data.
Okay, so right now, let's see. So now we're starting about categories that we could potentially provide. So let's think about what we had mentioned so far. So some of those are just like maybe research posters. Some of those might be student leader events, like things, yes, something that student orgs, something, we talked about tutoring. And now we're talking about booking. And so, yeah, we can start to identify these, start rolling those into the MVP, and then start assigning these to pods.
I do want to kind of caution against, like, I don't know if we should be aiming for all of these in the MVP.
I agree.
It's like a lot.
So let's talk about priority ranking now, right? Which of these should we fit into our system first and foremost, and then which might be called a high priority for the second refactor if we have time, and then a medium and then a low priority. So in terms of things, the database, that's clearly, I think, part of the MVP. Like, we can't launch this service without a database, for sure. The leak motion integration. We can't launch this, and even a bare bones version of the application without the leak motion. So we know we're going to need this. We know we're going to need this. The REST API. We're going to need at least a skeletal structure of a REST API just so that our client can connect to our server and our server can respond back to our client. So we know we're going to need that.
I feel like we need
A authentication system. Well, it's possible that we can kick this off into some later build. You might be saying, that's insane. How can you not have an administration system? Well, for the MVP build, hear me out, we can avoid the complexity of an administration authentication model and just give access to whoever has physical connection to that Raspberry Pi. If you're physically connected to the Raspberry Pi, you're an authenticated user. And you can put whatever data you want on that Raspberry Pi. And the system will still work at the external view as normal to everyone else.
Well, okay, so from my understanding, REST API is in charge of allowing the Raspberry Pis together. Because it's, the Raspberry Pis will be connected to servers, the Raspberry Pi will receive.
Right.
Okay, so what you should do to mitigate the risk of somebody putting something malicious is have it reset to a state every given point in time so that, you know, nothing's carried over.
Yeah, I mean, so the mechanism by which we could define how the intercommunication between the server and client, how that's going to be realized, is going to be based off of what ends up happening in that code. But either way, it's a mandatory thing that we have server client communication. regardless of what mechanism we use to transfer information between a server and client, right? So that's definitely gotta be part of our MVP build.
No,
But-
I got that part. I'm just saying like, since we're not going to use, we're not gonna have authentication as an MVP, which I mean, doesn't need to be. But we don't have to worry about somebody changing something or breaking it. If it just resets to a initial state.
I mean, my argument's gonna be, if we just think of having physical access to the server as your initial authentication model, that's how you prevent any kind of nefarious actions from
I
happening.
misunderstood. I heard access to the PI, not the server.
Yeah. Well, what I mean is, yeah, I'm sorry. I meant the Raspberry Pi that's acting as our server, as a server to our clients. So because remember, the idea here is our deployed environment for both our server and our client is going to be Raspberry Pis. So if we have full administrative control over the Raspberry Pi, and we're like and the Raspberry Pis themselves have a built-in authentication model, right? You need to have user login and passwords to gain access to that. We can rely on the built-in authentication model, the Raspberry Pi, as our authentication model for our application for our MVP build. Now, clearly in the future, you would want to expand that so that an administrator can have web-based access and not have to physically go into the swing lab to access the machine to make any changes. But we'll call that a high priority feature and not necessarily an MVP feature.
I just want to say that it's pretty easy and straightforward to set up a basic authentication system with fast API. So it's kind of, in my opinion, close to it. And also it's relatively straightforward to expose some endpoints to the CLI. So the page only wants to have access to the CLI locally, access the endpoints.
I would also agree. I would agree that there's a lot of tooling out there that makes deploying an authentication model very simple. I'd also say, given the amount of pods we have, we can likely flex an authentication model into the MVP without having to constrain or prevent us from deploying an MVP very rapidly. So let's include that. It would be preferable to have that. If we want it though, notice we could scapegoat this out into a high priority, but we'll include it as an MVP then. Because it sounds like we have a pod that wants to do that. Perfect. Okay. A UI, we need to have, even if it's an ugly UI, even if the buttons are just red and green squares, you need to have some kind of basic interface. It doesn't have to look nice, but this is definitely part of our MVP build. Okay, so then where we start to have to create a delineation now is, what is the MVP build going to do? That's just a basic showcase, a proof of concept, so that you can get stakeholder feedback. And maybe it's going to be something really simple, like being able to select between two different categories of images, like let's say student organizations and tutoring schedule.
I want to make sure I understand, when you say images, you're talking about containerization, like Docker?
Oh, I'm glad you bring that up. I'm not being very clear with my words. I'm talking about images, and we've had all these IT workshops and we've learned about Dockerization. No, I'm talking about like PNG images, JPEG images. I'm talking about using our kiosk as a mechanism to display visual data. The most common formats of visual data are probably either going to be PNG, a GIF, or JPEG, right? Either a GIF, a PNG, or a which, I mean, all these are easily like, it's trivial. These are trivial data structures, data formats that we can handle. And so the idea is that, think about what the current televisions are doing. They're just on a loop, as a slideshow showing one image to the other, and you have no control over what particular image is going to show. So at least as our base proof of concept model, we're going to give user agency, we'll give the end user agency over what they're looking at any given time. So when I say image, I'm literally talking about a image format.
Sign or what DOS is going to be on the.
It's Raspbian, isn't it?
Yeah.
Lead motion is the deciding factor.
Right.
Yeah, it's well, and a lot of that has to do with
Lead motion for-
We've got it to work with.
Yeah.
Like it's already said, it's already.
yeah, they had actually a team had dedicated itself inside of Ultraleap, the company that offers the Leap Motion, dedicated team just for Raspberry Pi support. And so that it has Ubuntu support, but not on ARM-based environments. So since Raspbian is always going to be an ARM-based environment, since that's the processor type on the Raspberry Pi, and if that's what's supported, then that's going to be our deployed state.
I was just wondering, like, Docker, and like last week, it's like 6 different virtualized environments on one network.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Back to the images and being able to select what you see, what about the directory?
So I think once we get the MVP built such that we have a client that you can select maybe between 2 sets of categories, and that connects to the server where you can manage the images, that contains your database and has your Leap Motion integration, then I think we start talking about the sets of the high priority features we add on top of that, which would be improving the mechanism by which we can select between the various types of images. Once we get to the next stage, which is going to be beyond our MVP, we can start talking about all the different roles. And once we start talking about all the different roles, we can start talking about advanced UI interactions with the end user. And so hopefully we can start talking about that. I'm going to be very, very optimistic and say a week and a half. We'll see. I mean, I don't think a bare bones model for the amount of teams we'll have is going to be very difficult.
What about a database management system? What we use?
It'd have to be.
I think the most commonly
The requirements for our database are going to be very light. So I'll leave it towards the teams to decide which technology they actually want to adopt.
one more thing, so right, you see we have 2 different systems. Back one,
That's right.
we have one repo. And if I think this can be quick, so I would suggest that we have 2 repos, for the back end and for the front end. Those are 2 highly different systems.
That is a very fair assessment. And yeah, we'll do that. We'll go ahead and create an additional repo that will be our client versus so right now we have the Kiosk. I think it's called what is this? The Touchless Kiosk system. So we'll create the Touchless Kiosk server as the second repo. And I think y'all have admin privileges. So I will allow for one of y'all to make the repo if you want.
I'm not sure if you can sort of save the project and the issues between the 2 repos. But that's all on that.
No, we'll just use one and then we can synchronize. Well, that'll be a issue we'll kick down the road for a moment.
Or maybe we can blur the issues, which show the backend issues to the backend, because with GitHub you can create branches directly.
Yeah.
Very nice.
So there's like the documentation, IT workshops with the requirement analysis repo. You can use that as like a overhead like project and then create two separate ones.
Yeah. That's also a very good suggestion as well. There's,
The backend repository, the backend projects, and then. But that might be.
we'll just, yeah, I think maybe to avoid some of the confusion for those teams working on the back end, on the client side versus the server side. It might just be easier to have the two different repos so that as they're getting changed, we can have different management on those repos so they don't fall out of sync as quickly. Okay, any other questions? Okay, yes, single source of truth. Make it easy. Okay, and again, a lot of these, that's what I'm saying, but this is really, I'm leaving the class itself to be the architects of this application as a whole, but that would be my guidance, I should say, in order to achieve your MVP build. I think your data requirements are going to be simple enough such that a single database should suffice. Okay, so does everyone have a clear understanding of what our MVP would do, and but then how we could potentially build on top of it, if given the time, to make it more complex so that we can start achieving these things like having various roles or of data that's accessible by the end user, then talking about how to make that easily accessible to the end user. And then maybe how we can have default views such that one kiosk shows a certain subset of the categories as opposed to other categories. Like for instance, if you're in front of the tutoring center, you might want to prioritize the tutor schedule and maybe some of the student org flyer information, not so much some of the other things that might make sense if it's in front of the main office. But that's not a feature we care about right now, right? That's going to be not part of the MVP build. What we care about right now is just getting a skeletal application that's working. Okay, with that said, let's start assigning tasks to teams today so we can start realizing this.
Easy. You pick that up.
I think you're the only.
Okay, so
I think you're the most excited group to take it, so.
So can you go into the project board and give yourself the database? Yes.
I believe the APIs database go hand in hand together.
Yes.
So in my opinion, it should be, or at least we should collaborate.
You should, that's going to be, yeah, I would recommend cross-pod collaboration. So that way you can work on the API and the authentication model and stay in touch. And again, the beautiful thing about the way Discord's set up is every pod has their own access points, their own dedicated communication. Okay. So
That needs to be
give me
added.
pod numbers again. Database was pod 4.
That needs to be added to the project board, doesn't it, or is it already there?
What's that?
That needs to be added to the project board, right?
Yes. Yes. Well, that's the thing. Let's clean up the project board right now. Let's make sure the project board actually reflects the task and to-do that's going to represent us actually achieving an MVP build. So I just wanted to make sure, leading into today, that all pods could post to the project board. And then the next thing I wanted to do was make sure we refactored our project board so it's actually accurate towards bringing us to the goal line, that milestone of actually achieving an MVP build. So at this point, we can edit some of the tasks in our task list such that it's representative of moving us forward where we need to go. So pod 4, please go ahead and create a task. What's that?
In progress.
It's going to be in progress because that's what you're going to start working on after this lecture.
We know what database we'll use, we should talk about that.
That is what you get to make that decision. use the database you feel most comfortable using. The one that you feel like you can get results from the quickest. This is an MVP build. You don't have to do like scalability analysis or anything like that. You just need something for data persistence and accessibility. Okay, was it pod 9 that said they wanted to do,
5 would be lead.
okay. So, this is the important part. When you start giving yourself tasks, make it describe what the outcome's gonna be as well. Next class, which is gonna be on Thursday, I'm gonna do a roll call on all pods to find out where we're at towards our MVP build. This is, at this point, we can use this time to make sure things are rolling, that there's accountability, and if we run into obstacles, now's the time to find out the obstacles we're gonna run into. Okay, so pod 4 is gonna be working on the database. Pod 5 is going to work with Leap Motion integration, which means who wants to work on user interface? Well, because whoever works on user interface, then these two are gonna be highly coupled.
I think we can do it.
Pod 7?
I think we're free until, we already have the Raspberry, I think we're just waiting to deploy it, so we can help however we can until the internet gets ready, then we can deploy it.
So, and presumably what you can do with user interfaces is, and by user interface is gonna be on the client side. So just creating something that allows you to maybe click a button that would create, and so when you build your user interface, build in a way where you can mock the data that you send to the server. So pretend the server gives a response and use that to give you a set of images. You can even have all the images preloaded on your client.
Yeah, I think we've done that already. We were trying to get into it with Iger's little thing. Looked it up, he looked it up, so maybe something like that. So I think we're good on that.
Excellent. And then you can just set this with mouse input with the expectation that you'll do it. And then later coordinate with pod 5 to find out how to get your mouse interactions, bind it to the Leap Motion.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let's do this. Let me erase. Let's do this. Okay. 4, 5, 7, 9. Okay. So other things that are going to be required is we said that we're going to need to have the some kind of image management, a solution for being able to upload images and being able to transfer images. Do we have a pod that wants to investigate the, I mean, that seems relatively simple in Python. What pod number? Pod C. What's that? Okay. So just make an outcome-driven description of how that fits into.
What is the last one?
So pod 3.
That'd be pretty easy. If we already have.
Okay, so let's think about what the current set of pods have. Oh, also, we need a. Do we have pod 1 here? Do we, and we have pod 2, pod 6? We don't have pod 6 here, don't want pod 6 to be pod 8. I like it, pod 8. So yeah, you want to start doing the initial research on the priority features and how you might plan to integrate those in. We can have pods that are future oriented too. So based off of the basic build, if all the other pods grab tasks that get us to a baseline implementation, we can have some pods thinking about how to integrate future features into the base implementation.
What we were thinking was the category.
Okay. I misthought of research. I was thinking about a pod planning how to start integrating future implementations into the, and I think that's important, some kind of integration considerations so that once the base, then you can start coordinating with the teams afterwards on what has to happen next.
So basically, the next Scrum Master.
Yes. Because we do have to assign a new Scrum Master this rotation as well.
Let's think about it.
Okay. Okay, let's see what we have. Let's see what we have.
We'll take the request form for the authentication.
There were, okay.
We're good. That's pod 4, right?
Pod 4.
No, we're pod 1, like that's pod 4 that took the authentication, right?
Yes, yes. But the request form would probably be, if I had to guess how the request form would work, it's not something that would go on the kiosk itself, right? Like the kiosk is probably just going to be public use and you interact with it. A request form, if you want to have data published onto the system, would probably have to be web-facing, right? So it's something that you'd probably access through a web browser.
So you do mobile.
And then that web browser could then make a request to the server and then send that information to the server. And honestly, that form, which can just, it honestly could just be an HTML page, that's even a static page, that's, well, I'm just saying, it could even just be a GitHub page. It could be a statically hosted GitHub page where the URL that it sends the submit request to would be the backend server. So you wouldn't even need to have like a dynamic server hosting that web portal. It could just be something that we can even self-host on the GitHub repository. Does that make sense? And it could just be an HTML form. And then when you hit submit, the HTML form would then send that data. Now, the important part is you also have to figure out how to encapsulate the images and send those also to the server. And then as a proof of concept, you can even just have a local web server that you then send it to, just so that you can kind of see how that mechanism works. So I like that idea, but I think the direction you bring that is web form to web server. Should be very simple. You should be able to do that very quickly. And again, look, for this class, I encourage you to use, for quick prototyping, AI tools. You don't have to avoid AI tools, right? If it makes your ability to create prototype code quicker, that's fine. Oh, wait, what pod was this? Pod 1. Please update the project boards right now too. I'm putting this here. Can the pod A work on what? Yeah, yes, yes. Because we can start I think we have enough pods that we can be future planning. So even though some of these don't necessarily fit into the MVP build, as soon as we have the MVP built, you can start integrating the code you've been working. And then we can very rapidly start getting to our second cycle build. Because we have enough teams to do that. So what pod number were you? Hey.
Using that version.
Pod 6.
I already.
Pod 2.
Yes.
We have pod 2 and we have pod 6. Do you have an idea of what you want? Okay, so
We're gonna launch into the next program.
perfect. That was exactly what I was hoping. That's perfect. So pod 6.
Yeah,
Maybe. Let me do that right now.
I would have to.
Pod 2.
Yeah.
Have you made a decision on what you're going to do? It's have a good thing that needs to happen. Need to update the documentation for the MVP. So we need a documentation team that checks in with all the other pods, and everything we just defined here is gonna have to get assimilated and shared with the rest. Everyone understands how our MVP is building. We talked about it now, but it's gotta be encoded inside of our lineage. So you can be like the documentarian. I'll share this lecture with you too, and I'll give you the transcript on it as well. And run the transcript into again an AI tool. And I'll help you summarize it. So pod 2 is going to be our documentarian.
I mean, I don't know what to do.
And that leaves just pod 6, who is not here today. Oh, you're pod 6? Perfect. That part, you want to continue to take because like I was telling some other problems, you have no pods, we need to have roles. So you can start working on high priority with an idea of how to integrate it. So on our next after that, we can start moving on and then you can start your code forward. This is, you're gonna want to communicate. So you're gonna want to communicate with mod 7 because they're gonna be working on you on. So that's gonna be the teaser, and we're actually gonna have 2 different platforms, one for front end, one's gonna represent the kiosk, and one that's gonna be the server, which is gonna be the thing that syncs with all the kiosks, disseminates the data, and kind of synchronizes the data that's right out of our site. Right? And so what you can do now is, even the absence of you just fills out effectively talk with you on so that the building one and you see the setting because you don't have to wait for the all the work is done with so definitely coordinate with the other partners. And so your work might not be with the ideas that okay.
Yeah, okay. My bad. Can I retract my UI build? I thought I was deploying the UI.
You want to
Well, we-
deploy the UI? Work
That-
with,
Because that's me, like, shouldn't UI be GUI? Pod, like, C or something?
user interface, right?
Yeah, user interface, so, yeah.
Well, actually, I have someone who wants to. I do take your. So, yeah. Well, the MVP UI. MVP UI, remember, the MVP file, all we need to do is have two buttons, giving both A and B. When you click on A, it'll start one set of slideshows, on B, it'll start on the other slide. Oh, the team that's responsible, the project that's responsible for image management, you wanna figure out how potentially to do a slideshow. That would be nice to know. Yes.
That we're responsible for the documentation,
We need, yeah, so one of the things we need is to look out. That a lot, clearly, on today's class, there's miscommunication on understanding the bill. So everything we've articulated today has to be encoded to support the documentation, so that every document knows exactly what's part of the MVP, what's part of pipeline, what's the next developer, so that we don't have people confused on what they're supposed to be working. I think we need this for class. Future classes on how.
Yeah, if we don't do our job, like, they're gonna come in and after the course.
That's all about legacy. And on future class, when you, your legacy code. Well. Backdoors and stuff.
Find all of the security vulnerabilities.
5 years ago, we logging in.
See, you think about it. What did it say? Oh,
Okay, and then. 8.
What's you, since you had?
Pod B. I don't know if we didn't have Pod B here today. So we're gonna have to follow up with Pod B and make sure, and which I'll find on the project list. That's a nice thing about this class and having tasks. I can instantly see what pods are committing to the project or not. Which, as we know, that factors into the overall grade. Is gonna be the contribution level each pod has to the final deploy project. So we'll definitely have to communicate with Pod B, and that'll be the role of the Scrum team. Which you should now have those roles, and let me double check.
Then yeah.
Okay, so let me know. That should have pinged all the Scrum. So we should now have the Scrum.
Well, the pitches. Yeah, so like.
Perfect.
whenever you hit it is, that's what I would assume. Or the UI would interpret that. Yeah. And that's-
Okay, now let me see here.
Maybe, I'll have to make her scratch it. I would have to make some kind of velocity. Yeah, so I would literally just have to. Maybe they already have something.
Okay, so since I have just about 10 minutes left, I want to follow up today's lecture. We're doing a roll call once more and just verify that each pod knows what the responsibility is, leading to our next check-in point, which is going to be on Thursday in 2 days. So pod 1, what is your current set of tasks that you're working on? Towards- Okay, pod 2.
Document speech.
So request form using web-based technologies. Documentation, you're gonna unify the living document that includes everything we talked about today. So everyone can operate based off of what we discussed, but have something written down. Like we've discussed before, in an agile cycle, it's important that we keep our documentation in line with where we're currently at. So we're not working on old data. And that way we can ensure that our project boards and our task list are accurate. Okay, pod 3. Tutoring. And just out of curiosity, do you have an idea of what that implementation is going to look like? Excellent. Excellent. If for any reason you have any questions, you can go ahead and, or have any issues or obstacles, let me know. Pod 5, lead motion. Pod 6.
What would pod 4?
Pod 4 was,
Database.
yeah, database. Pod 6.
Dashboard.
Wait, pod 5 is lead motion.
Sorry.
Pod 6, no, yeah, you're typing it all down. I can respect that. Pod 6.
The dashboard for implementing partners.
Well, I think, are you taking over the front end, the basic GUI? Are you comfortable using tkinter?
I've never used it.
So this would be, well, this gives you a chance to decide what the front end tooling is going to be. I think the IT workshop used tkinter, but if you're familiar with some other GUI, you're making the MVP build on that.
I know they're doing.
Yeah, I thought
Pod
You're
7.
doing that? Okay. So you're doing so just make sure that it's in line then. So you are.
We were talking about switching, but it's he's talking to.
You're working on old information. Okay, so you are still gonna do the
Yeah.
windowing system. I'll call it a windowing system.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, if y'all want, y'all can talk, more about it.
Yeah,
Yes.
we're gonna discuss this later.
Yeah, and collaborate and coordinate.
Yeah.
Just whoever ends up doing the main GUI stuff, please come talk to me eventually.
Just understand The GUI stuff is happening in different phases, it sounds like. We're gonna have the MVP phase so that we can do a trial test first and early. So it's gonna be super simple. And then it sounds like what you want to start working on is gonna be the more complex second phase stuff that'll be integrated after an MVP build. So it is important that y'all integrate, so you start, that y'all discuss, so you can talk about integration in the future. So that your code will seamlessly integrate into how you have yours designed to just be kind of the kind of stupid build of just push this, push that. Obviously, no one will see that in the final build, but just gives us the mechanism to test out a version of the application in its most basic form. And that's all you have to deliver, because we want to try to get an MVP build very quick. We're talking about in like a week, so that we can start putting the more interesting features on top of it. And so where did I last leave off? Pod 6, pod 7?
So does that mean pod 6 is helping with the UI?
Yes. Yes. So pod 6 is going to be it's going to be UI, but for research or whatnot, right? And so we'll call that cycle 2. So not part of the MVP build. They're going to be pre-implementing things that are going to be added after our MVP is deployed.
I was gonna say, if it's UI research, it's more like UX.
Yeah.
But I guess UI research.
So they're going to be working on different views that are more complex than the MVP one, so that once we get the MVP out, we can start adding their code and immediately rolling out cycle 2. Pod 7.
That's the UI design.
Okay, perfect. Pod 8 is our Scrum team.
Yeah.
So they'll be ensuring that code can be integrated, that everyone's on track, and that what the future set of things are going to be. They're going to be the main contact points.
So should we, documentation also work with the Scrum to make sure that?
Yes, of course, yeah.
It's not even the right concept.
So.
Pod 9 is working on API and authentication. Pod A is working on, Pod A, what are you working on? Right here, booking system. So that is not an MVP. So that's not an MVP, that's a cycle 2, not cycle 1. That will integrate into the next build.
Yeah. Even, it could be.
And for the booking system, consider being able to see, at least with dummy data, what the current set of bookings are, like a calendar of what's already taken when you make a request.
You can have it so that.
Pod B. Pod B, what was Pod B working on again? Is Pod B here? Okay, so we have to contact Pod B. And then Pod C is image management. So look, we intend to do a lot of things with images. That's going to be the main metaphor on how we disseminate information in a kiosk. So we need a very robust, flexible, and powerful image management tooling inside, so that like we can maybe set times and create slideshows, or be able to go ahead and interface seamlessly, and do so with a way that not only allows you to go ahead and transfer data, well, most importantly, work with the UI team to make sure that the way that the tools you're going to use is going to be complicit with how we're going to actually show windowing systems. Like other things you might want to factor in is like things that you'll want to consider as image management is to uniform the aspect ratios, right? To make sure that they're fit well on the TV, or we can just we can enforce an aspect ratio too. Like we can reject images that don't fit a certain requirement. But if you have high resolution images, we got to make sure that you'll figure it out, right? Like there's lots of things that go into image management.
So is the tutoring schedule also cycle two?
Yes, yeah, because cycle one is simply going to be database server clients with lead code and integration. Very simple interface, client sends a request to the server grabs data from the database returns that information to the server responds to that request to the client, and they're going to show that it will come. And that shows the network application that has lead function integration that does a task that you did all the time.
Can you talk about freedom in the diagram? I'm sorry.
Wait, but it's only one. Are we, then why do they only do one?
Yes, we're done. We will reconvene and do check-ins on all the teams and on Thursday, just to see where we're at. Because at this point, we need to get to an MVP build rapidly. Especially since we actually have Thanksgiving inside of November. So with the amount of teams we have, this won't be a big ask, right? But it's important that we coordinate together to actually seamlessly integrate all of our work so that we can get to our deployed states before we hit the second week or the first week of December, like the end of the first week of December. It's like, our presentations are what, like December 10th? Is that like around finals? I forget.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's gonna be the time where we need to have something we can show off. But we want to show our stakeholders our proof of concept. So ideally, within, let's say, next Tuesday or next Thursday, sometime next week, we should have the ability to deploy onto Raspberry Pis the MVP build. It's super easy build though, like if you think about it, and again, use ChatGPT if you need to quickly prototype code. I'm not against that, to get something very quickly and rapidly thrown together, just so we can start showing something off.
I love that.
Okay, so all pods know what they're doing. We will reconvene on Thursday and check in.
Probably I won't be here. Wait, you won't be here Tuesday? I won't be here Thursday, I mean.